There is a river in northern China that has killed more people than almost any other force in human history. It has drowned villages overnight. It has buried farmland under 10 feet of silt without warning. It has changed its course so dramatically and so suddenly that cities that once sat on its banks woke up to find it had moved 60 miles away. The Chinese have called it China's sorrow for as long as anyone can remember. They have also lived beside it, farmed beside it, and built one of the most durable civilizations the world has ever produced beside it for 4,000 unbroken years. The story of China does not begin with an emperor or a battle or a moment of divine inspiration. It begins with ordinary people standing at the edge of a river that is actively trying to destroy them, looking at each other and deciding to stay. That decision, stubborn, practical, collective, made without ceremony by people whose names were never written down, is the foundation of everything that follows. By around 2100 BC, the Yellow River Valley is already a place of surprising complexity. The communities taking shape along its banks and in the low highlands above it are not the simple hunter-gatherer settlements that most civilizations began with. They are organized. They build walls around their towns, not impressive walls, not the walls that would come later, but real walls of rammed earth that represent weeks of collective labor and the decision to define a boundary between inside and outside, between the community and the space beyond it. They store grain in pits lined against moisture, creating reserves against the bad years that the river guarantees will come. They produce pottery of a technical quality that required generations of accumulated knowledge to achieve thin-walled, precisely fired, decorated with patterns that show aesthetic choices being made and refined across time. And somewhere in this period, in fragments and marks that archaeologists have been debating and analyzing for over a century, the earliest traceable ancestors of the Chinese writing system begin to appear. Not yet a full script. Not yet a system capable of recording complex ideas, but marks that carry meaning, that are recognized and repeated, that represent the beginning of the longest continuous written tradition in human history. What makes the Yellow River Valley civilization distinctive? What separates it from the other early civilizations rising in Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus Valley in the same broad period is the particular nature of the prize, problem it was organized around solving. The Nile flooded predictably, on a schedule, depositing rich silt in a pattern so reliable that Egyptian farmers could plan around it. The Yellow River flooded unpredictably, violently, in amounts that varied enormously from year to year, carrying not just water, but the enormous loads of yellow silt that give it its name, and that could bury a field, a village, or an entire district in a single catastrophic season. Managing this river required not just individual ingenuity or local cooperation, but coordination across large areas and long time periods, the kind of coordination that requires authority, record-keeping, and the willingness of many communities to work together on a problem that none of them could solve alone. The social and political structures that the Yellow River forced into existence were, from the very beginning, oriented toward large-scale collective action. That orientation toward the group rather than the individual, toward the long term rather than the immediate, toward the practical problem rather than the abstract principle, became embedded in Chinese civilization at a level so deep that 4,000 years of subsequent history have never fully dislodged it. Into this world steps the figure of Yu the Great, standing exactly at the boundary between legend and history, between the time that Chinese civilization remembers in stories and the time it remembers in documents. Yu is credited with the founding of the Xia Dynasty, the first dynasty in the traditional Chinese historical sequence, and with the engineering feat that made settled civilization in the Yellow River Valley genuinely sustainable, the construction of a comprehensive flood control system of channels, dikes, and drainage works that tamed, or at least managed, the river's worst tendencies. The story of how he did this has been told in China for 4,000 years, and the detail that has survived every retelling, that every version of the story insists on, is not about the engineering. It is about the 13 years he spent away from home. He passed his own gate, the accounts say, 3 times during those years. 3 times he was close enough to hear the sounds of his household, to know that his wife was there, that his son had been born while he was away. 3 times he kept walking. The work was not finished. The river was not controlled. His family could wait. The problem could not. Whether Yu the Great was a single historical person, a legendary composite of many engineers across many generations, or something in between, a real man, whose story absorbed the achievements of others over centuries of retelling, is a question that historians and archaeologists continue to debate. What is not debatable is what the story of Yu was chosen to say about Chinese civilization's founding values. Other ancient civilizations chose founding heroes who were warriors, or kings, or gods. The civilization that would outlast all of them chose a man who built drainage channels and stayed away from his family for 13 years because the work required it. That is a statement about what kind of civilization China intended to be, not a statement made by any single person or any deliberate policy, but the accumulated expression of a people who had learned from their river what mattered most, and who built their first myths around those lessons. The farmers who survived beside the Yellow River passed their knowledge forward, generation by generation, until the villages became towns and the towns became cities, and the cities became the first recognizable Chinese states. And those states discovered, almost immediately, that the most dangerous thing in their world was not the river, it was each other, and the question of who had the right to rule. Every civilization that has ever existed has needed to answer one question before it could function. Why does this person get to rule, and not that one? The answers humanity has produced to that question across history are surprisingly few. Blood, the ruler rules because of who their parents were. Force, the ruler rules because they can stop anyone who disagrees. Divine right, the ruler rules because a god chose them. China, around 1600 BC, produced an answer that was more sophisticated than any of these, more flexible, and ultimately more dangerous to every ruler who ever used it. The answer was not that the ruler was chosen by the gods in some permanent, unconditional way. The answer was that the ruler was permitted by heaven, and that permission could be withdrawn. That single qualification changed everything. It built a moral accountability into the Chinese political system at a level so fundamental that no subsequent dynasty, no matter how powerful, could fully escape it. And it guaranteed, with a certainty that took centuries to fully appreciate, that every dynasty which rose would eventually fall not necessarily to a stronger army, but to the logic of its own founding justification. The Tang Dynasty, which rose around 1600 BC and dominated the Yellow River Basin for over 5 centuries, was the civilization that the mandate of heaven was eventually used to overthrow, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms before it is understood as someone else's cautionary tale. The Western imagination, when it thinks of ancient China at all, tends toward images of serene scholars and delicate ink paintings, a civilization of quiet refinement and Confucian propriety. The Shang were something genuinely different. They were a warrior aristocracy of considerable sophistication, presiding over a bronze-working tradition of technical quality that would not be equaled in Europe for another 1,000 years. Their bronze vessels, enormous ritual containers cast with intricate surface decoration, used in ceremonies that connected the living to the ancestors, represent an achievement of metallurgical science that required generations of accumulated knowledge and the coordination of large numbers of specialized workers. The people who made these objects understood chemistry and heat and the properties of metals in ways that are not primitive by any measure. And these same people practiced human sacrifice at the graves of their kings on a scale that their archaeological record makes impossible to overlook or minimize. What makes the Shang uniquely visible to us across 3,500 years of separation is not their bronze vessels or their burial sites, but their oracle bones, the animal bones, and turtle shells on which they recorded. Their consultations with the divine. The process was straightforward and strange simultaneously. A question was formulated, a question about the harvest, about military campaigns, about the king's health, about whether a planned action would be auspicious or dangerous. The bone or shell was heated until it cracked. A priest read the crack patterns as the answer from the ancestral spirits or from the high god D. And then, remarkably, the question and often the answer were scratched into the surface of the bone itself, creating a record. Tens of thousands of these bones have been recovered from archaeological sites. They sit in museum collections in Beijing and Taipei and London and cities across the world, and the writing on them is recognizably ancestral to the Chinese script, used today a direct written line stretching 3,500 years without breaking. The questions on them are, as has been noted by every scholar who has read them, startlingly ordinary. Will the rain come this week? Will the hunt to the east be successful? Does the pain in the king's tooth mean that an ancestor is displeased? Is the queen's pregnancy going well? The questions of a man trying to govern a difficult territory and manage an uncertain future with the tools his civilization had given him, which happened to include a sophisticated bureaucracy of divination that treated every decision as something requiring divine consultation. The Zhou people who overthrew the last Shang king around 1046 BC were, at the time of their revolt, a frontier people from the western edge of the Shang sphere of influence, less wealthy, less culturally elaborate, but militarily effective and politically ambitious. Their problem, once they had won, was the same problem that every successful rebel faces. They needed to explain why what they had done was legitimate rather than simply opportunistic. The mandate of heaven was their answer, and it was brilliant in the specific way that ideas are brilliant when they are flexible enough to do many different jobs simultaneously. Heaven, a moral force, rather than a specific deity, watched over human affairs and granted to virtuous rulers the permission to govern. When rulers became cruel, corrupt, and indifferent to the welfare of the people, heaven withdrew that permission. The withdrawal of permission was signaled by specific signs: natural disasters, failed harvests, military defeats, peasant rebellions. When those signs accumulated sufficiently, a new ruler would arise who embodied virtue, and heaven would grant its mandate to them instead. The previous dynasty's fall was not just a military event, it was a moral judgment, and the new dynasty's rise was not just a military victory, it was a cosmic correction. The genius of this framework, and it was genuinely genius, in the cold sense of an idea that performs its function with extraordinary efficiency, was that it made political change morally intelligible without requiring it to be religiously miraculous. No one needed to claim that a god had appeared in a dream or that a divine voice had spoken from the sky. The evidence of the mandate was visible in ordinary events: good governance, successful harvests, military victories, social stability. The evidence of its loss was equally visible: tyranny, famine, defeat, chaos. Every person in the society could read the signs. And this meant that every person in the society was, in a sense, continuously evaluating whether the current rulers still held heaven's permission. The mandate of heaven was the most sophisticated early warning system for dynastic failure ever devised. It was also a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it taught every Chinese person that rulers who failed morally deserved to fall. It guaranteed that when a dynasty did begin to fail, when the floods came, and the harvests failed, and the armies lost, there would be no shortage of people ready to interpret those failures as evidence that heaven had already made its decision, and that the only question was, who would be the instrument of its correction? The Zhou ruled for over 800 years longer than any other dynasty in Chinese history, and their fall illustrated the trap perfectly. They did not lose to a foreign conqueror or a single catastrophic military defeat. They lost slowly, over centuries, to the logic of a system in which power naturally drained from the center to the periphery, as regional lords accumulated their own armies, their own revenues, and their own legitimacy. By the time the Zhou court was a shadow of its former authority, the lords who nominally served it had become kings in everything except the name, and the name was the only thing keeping the fiction of Zhou sovereignty alive. When that fiction finally became unsustainable, what followed was not a swift transition to a new dynasty, but 2.5 centuries of catastrophic war between the successor states, the Warring States period, in which the Chinese heartland was soaked in blood on a scale that the ancient world had rarely seen. And out of that blood, out of that particular darkness, came the ideas that would define Chinese civilization for the next 2,000 years. The chaos and the philosophy were not separate stories. The chaos was the reason the philosophy was necessary, and the philosophy was the civilization's attempt to make sure the chaos could never happen again, an attempt that succeeded and failed, across 4,000 years in a pattern so regular it begins to feel like breathing. The philosophers who tried to answer that chaos, who sat in the ruins of a civilization that had just spent 200 years destroying itself, and asked what had gone wrong and how it could be prevented, were about to produce the most consequential body of ideas in East Asian history. And they were doing it in the middle of a war that had not yet ended. There is a pattern that appears, with uncomfortable regularity, across the history of human civilization. The periods of greatest intellectual achievement are rarely the periods of greatest stability. They are the periods of greatest crisis, when everything that a society believed about itself is suddenly and violently proven wrong, when the structures that organize daily life collapse faster than new ones can be built to replace them, when people are living through the kind of sustained catastrophe that strips away every comfortable assumption. That is when the deepest thinking happens. Not because suffering produces wisdom automatically, but because suffering of sufficient scale and duration forces the questions that comfortable times allow people to avoid. What are we doing wrong? What does a good society actually require? What is the human being at its core, and what does that mean for how we should be governed? The Warring States period of Chinese history, which ran roughly from 475 BC to 221 BC, was one of the most violent and destructive eras in the ancient world. It was also the period that produced the ideas that Chinese civilization would live inside for the next 2,000 years. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the connection between them is not ironic. It is the point. 7 major states competed for dominance across the Chinese heartland during this period: Qin, Chu, Yan, Han, Wei, Zhao, and Qi, and the scale of the warfare between them staggers any attempt to describe it adequately. Battles in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC involved armies of hundreds of thousands of men on each side. The Battle of Changping in 260 BC between the states of Qin and Zhao is recorded as resulting in the capture of over 400,000 Zhao soldiers, who were subsequently buried alive on the orders of the Qin commander, an act of mass killing so enormous that historians still debate whether the figure is accurate, and yet find no reason in the archaeological record to dismiss it entirely. Individual cities were besieged for years, their populations starving behind walls while the surrounding farmland was destroyed. Entire regions lost significant portions of their population within single generations. The demographic damage was visible for centuries afterward, in the patterns of resettlement and repopulation that subsequent dynasties had to manage. This was not a period of small wars between professional armies. It was a period of total mobilization, of entire societies organized around the single priority of survival in a world where defeat meant destruction. Confucius died in 479 BC, which places him at the very beginning of the Warring States period, and the world he described in his teachings was already, in his lifetime, falling apart around him. He had been born into a social order, the Zhou system of ritual relationships between lords and rulers, and subjects that his entire education and sensibility had prepared him to honor and inhabit. He watched that order collapse in real time, reduced to a fiction maintained in ceremony, while the actual business of power was conducted through violence and betrayal. His response was not to accept the collapse as evidence that the old values had been wrong. His response was to argue that the collapse was evidence that the old values had been abandoned and that the only way forward was to recover them, to practice them with greater discipline and greater sincerity than the generation that had let them go. His teaching centered on the concept of Ren, a word that is translated variously as benevolence, humanness, or simply human goodness as the quality that made right relationships possible. A ruler who cultivated Ren would govern well because his goodness would spread outward through his officials to the people. A father who cultivated Ren would raise children who understood their proper role in the family and by extension in society. The logic was consistent from the smallest domestic unit to the largest political structure. Get the relationships right, get the character of the people in those relationships right, and the social order would hold itself together. What made Confucius's ideas survive, while the ideas of hundreds of other thinkers from the same period faded into obscurity, was not simply that they were true in the philosophical sense. No system of social thought is simply true or false. And Confucianism has real limitations that its critics identified clearly from the beginning. What made them survive was that they were practical in a specific way. They told rulers what to do. They told officials what to do. They told parents and children what to do. They provided a vocabulary for every social situation and a framework for resolving every social conflict. They were, in the deepest sense, useful not to idealists who wanted to imagine a perfect society, but to actual human beings trying to organize actual communities in a world that was constantly threatening to come apart. And they were flexible enough to accommodate almost any political reality while providing a consistent language for judging that reality. A brutal ruler could be criticized in Confucian terms. An effective ruler could be praised in Confucian terms. The framework could justify almost anything and criticize almost anything, which made it indispensable to everyone regardless of their actual politics. But while Confucius was teaching his students to look inward at the quality of human relationships, other thinkers were looking outward at the mechanics of power, and what they saw led them to very different conclusions. Han Fei, writing in the 3rd century BC at the end of the Warring States period, had read Confucius carefully and found him dangerously naive. The problem with governing through virtue, Han Fei argued, was that it depended on a supply of virtuous people that reality did not reliably provide. Rulers were not reliably good. Officials were not reliably loyal. People were not reliably benevolent. They were reliably self-interested, and this was not a moral failing to be corrected through education, but a fact of human nature to be incorporated into the design of the governing system. A lock on a door, Han Fei noted, is not an insult to the honest. It is a sensible precaution given the existence of the dishonest. Law worked the same way. Clear rules, consistently enforced, with rewards for compliance and severe punishments for violation, would produce orderly behavior from people who would not have produced it voluntarily. The state did not need to be loved. It needed to be obeyed. And the conditions of obedience could be engineered through the right system of incentives and consequences, regardless of the moral character of the individuals involved. The state of Qin, in the far west of the Chinese world, adopted legalist principles earlier and more systematically than any of the other warring states, and the results were visible in its military effectiveness, its economic organization, and its willingness to apply violence with a consistency that its rivals found both appalling and, ultimately, impossible to match. It was Qin that would end the warring states period. It was Qin philosophy, cold, systematic, indifferent to sentiment, that would build the first unified Chinese empire. And it was the failure of that philosophy, applied without Confucian balance, that would destroy the empire it built within a single generation, leaving behind the question that every subsequent Chinese dynasty would spend its existence trying to answer. How do you hold together a civilization of hundreds of millions of people across a territory the size of a continent, without either the cruelty that the legalists made possible or the naivety that the Confucians were vulnerable to? The philosophers of the Warring States period did not solve this problem. They defined it so clearly that China has been working on it ever since. The man who thought he had solved it, who believed that legalist efficiency applied at full scale could build an empire that would last 10,000 generations, was already consolidating his power in the state of Qin. His name was Ming Dynasty. History would call him the first emperor, and he would change the world in ways that neither he nor anyone around him could fully predict, for better and for worse, simultaneously, in ways that still cannot be cleanly separated. He was 38 years old when he ran out of enemies. For 2 decades, the king of Qin had been doing what no ruler in Chinese history had managed to do before him, absorbing, one by one, the other 6 major states of the Warring States period, until the land that had been at war with itself for 2.5 centuries was, for the first time, under a single authority. The last rival state fell in 221 BC. And Ming Dynasty, standing at the summit of a conquest that had cost millions of lives and reshaped an entire civilization, made a decision that revealed everything about how he understood what he had done. He did not take an existing title. He did not call himself king, because king was what the rulers of the states he had just destroyed had called themselves. He invented a new title, Qin Shi Huang, the first August emperor, and declared that his dynasty would last 10,000 generations. The arrogance of that declaration is easy to note from a distance of 2,000 years. What is harder to note, and equally true, is that the country he built in the 15 years that followed has never entirely ceased to exist. The speed and comprehensiveness of the first emperor's transformation of his new empire is genuinely difficult to absorb. He was not a man who conquered a territory and then administered it. He was a man who conquered a territory and then immediately began remaking it from the foundations up, with an energy and a certainty that left no space between victory and reconstruction. The currency of the empire was standardized one monetary system, replacing the incompatible currencies of 7 different states. The weights and measures were standardized one system of units, so that a merchant in the far south and a tax collector in the far north were working in the same numerical language. The roads were built a network of imperial highways, radiating from the capital that moved armies and goods and information across the empire with a speed that the fragmented world of the warring states had never achieved. The northern defensive walls that various states had built independently over centuries were connected and extended into a continuous barrier against the nomadic peoples of the steppe, the beginning of what would eventually, through many centuries of subsequent construction, become the Great Wall. All of this happened in roughly a decade. The human cost of the labor required to accomplish it, the hundreds of thousands of conscripted workers who died, building the wall, the roads, the palaces, the emperor's own tomb, which was being excavated and furnished with an army of 8,000 terracotta soldiers, while the emperor was still alive, was treated as an acceptable price by a government that had been built on the legalist premise that human beings were resources to be deployed rather than people to be considered. The standardization of the written script deserves particular attention because its consequences were so much larger and so much longer lasting than anything else the first emperor did. China is not, and has never been, a linguistically unified country in the way that the word country often implies. The spoken languages of different Chinese regions are not dialects of the same language in the way that American and British English are dialects of the same language. They are, in the technical sense, different languages mutually unintelligible, so different that a person from Guangdong and a person from Beijing, speaking their respective native tongues, understand each other approximately, as well as a Spanish speaker understands a Romanian speaker, which is to say, barely or not at all. This linguistic diversity has been a feature of the Chinese world for as long as records exist, and it has never been resolved at the level of spoken language. What the first emperor did, by imposing a standardized written script across the entire empire, was create a layer of communication above the level of spoken language, a written system that could be read by educated people everywhere, regardless of what they said when they opened their mouths. A document written in the imperial capital could be read in a city 500 miles away by an official who could not understand a word of the capital's spoken dialect. The law could travel. The tax records could travel. The imperial orders could travel. And, more importantly than any of these administrative functions, a shared, written culture could develop across a territory too large and too linguistically diverse to share a spoken culture. The educated class of China, across every subsequent dynasty and every period of political fragmentation, retained a written language that held their shared identity together when everything else was pulling it apart. The script changed enormously across 2.5 millennia. The principle of a single written standard never did. That principle was the first emperor's most lasting achievement, and he achieved it in the same decade that he burned the books. The burning of the books is the act that subsequent Chinese culture used again and again to define what tyranny looked like, and understanding why requires understanding what exactly was being burned and why the burning failed. The legalist Chancellor Li Si, who was the most important architect of Qin imperial policy after the emperor himself, identified the Confucian intellectual tradition as the most dangerous threat to political stability. Not because Confucian scholars were planning rebellions. They were, for the most part, exactly what they appeared to be, men devoted to texts and teaching. The danger was more subtle. The Confucian texts praised past dynasties and past practices. They gave people a framework for comparing the present unfavorably with the past. They provided a vocabulary of moral criticism that could be applied to any government that fell short of the standards the texts described. In a political system built on the premise that the emperor's will was law, and that criticism of the emperor was the beginning of disorder, texts that taught people to evaluate the present against the standard of the past were genuinely subversive, not because of what they said explicitly, but because of the habit of comparative judgment they cultivated in anyone who read them carefully. The solution Li Si proposed, and the emperor accepted, was to remove the framework, burn the texts, execute the scholars who refused to surrender them, leave only the books that served the practical needs of the state, agriculture, medicine, divination, and destroy everything else. The logic was legalist to its core. Eliminate the inputs that produce the outputs you do not want. And it did not work. It could not work, for a reason that the legalist framework was structurally unable to perceive. The ideas in the Confucian texts were not contained in the physical objects of the texts themselves. They were contained in the people who had read them, memorized them, discussed them, and built their entire understanding of the world around them. Those people were not all executed. Many hid. Many memorized what they could not hide. Many taught students who had never seen the original texts, but carried the ideas in their minds through the Qin period and out the other side. When the Qin dynasty collapsed 3 years after the first emperor's death, 15 years after the dynasty's founding, in a wave of rebellions that demonstrated with brutal efficiency that a government built on fear alone has no loyalty to call upon, when the fear begins to fail, the scholars came back out. The texts were reconstructed from memory and from the hidden copies that had survived. The Confucian tradition that the first emperor had tried to destroy re-emerged, not weakened but arguably strengthened by the experience of surviving suppression, and became the official state philosophy of the dynasty that replaced the Qin. The man who tried to erase intellectual history left behind a unified country and a lesson about the limits of force that Chinese civilization has been citing ever since. You can burn the books, you cannot burn the ideas. The dynasty that inherited the unified China the first emperor had built learned that lesson quickly, and built something that would last not 15 years, but 400. Not by abandoning the structures of imperial power, but by filling them with a philosophy that gave the people inside them a reason to believe the structure was worth maintaining. The man who founded the Han Dynasty was not supposed to be an emperor. Liu Bang was a minor local official from a farming family, not a noble, not a scholar, not a military commander of distinguished lineage. He was, by the standards of every civilization that had preceded him, exactly the wrong kind of person to found the dynasty that would define Chinese identity for the next 2,000 years. He drank too much. He was coarse in his manners. The scholars who eventually served him found his personal habits difficult to accept. He once urinated into a Confucian scholar's ceremonial hat to express his contempt for ceremony, and then, as emperor, came to understand that ceremony was the thing that made power legible to the people who had to accept it, and invited the scholars back. That arc, from contempt for the structures of civilization to a grudging recognition that those structures were what held civilization together, was the arc of the Han Dynasty itself, and it produced something that the first emperor's brutal efficiency never could. It produced a system that people were willing to maintain because they believed, at some level, that it was worth maintaining. The early Han emperors governed with a deliberate lightness that was a direct response to the Qin's catastrophic overreach. Taxes were reduced, conscription was limited, the legal code was simplified. Farmers who had been driven off their land by Qin construction projects were allowed to return. The philosophical approach, drawing heavily on Taoist ideas about minimal intervention, allowing things to find their natural level rather than forcing them into shapes that required constant coercion to maintain, was not idealism. It was strategic recovery. The Han court understood that it had inherited a population exhausted by decades of war and coerced labor, a bureaucracy that had been traumatized by the Qin's treatment of officials, and an agricultural economy that needed years of undisturbed seasons to recover its productive capacity. The lightness of early Han governance was not weakness. It was the intelligent application of patience to a problem that patience could solve and force could not. Within 3 generations, the population had recovered, the economy was growing, and the Han court had the resources to begin the more ambitious projects that would define the dynasty's legacy. The Emperor Wu, who came to power in 141 BC and ruled for 54 years, was the Han ruler who transformed the dynasty from a recovery project into a civilization-defining institution, and the most important thing he did was not any of his famous military campaigns. It was a decision about education. Wu made Confucianism the official state philosophy, established the Imperial Academy, the Taishui, for the study of the Confucian classics, and embedded in the emerging structure of Chinese governance the principle that the path to official power ran through demonstrated mastery of a body of texts that encoded a specific set of values. This was revolutionary in a way that can be difficult to appreciate from a modern perspective because it has become so thoroughly normalized in the Chinese tradition. In every other major ancient civilization, political power was primarily a function of birth or military success. In Han China, under the principle Wu established, it was, at least in theory, and increasingly in practice, a function of learning. A man who could demonstrate genuine mastery of the Confucian texts could rise in government regardless of who his father was. The texts themselves, the Analects, the Book of Changes, the Book of Songs, the historical classics were not mere academic exercises. They were instruction manuals for governance, ethics, and the management of human relationships, studied with the understanding that mastering them was preparation for the actual work of running an empire. The implications took generations to fully unfold, but when they did, they were transformative at a civilizational level. The entire educated class of China officials, scholars, teachers, the men who actually administered the empire at every level, from the capital to the most remote county seat, shared a common body of texts, a common vocabulary of values, and a common set of assumptions about what good governance looked like. This shared intellectual culture was more cohesive than any system of ethnic identity and more durable than any political structure because it lived in the minds of the people who had been educated into it and could survive the collapse of any particular dynasty. When the Han fell, the officials who had served it carried the Confucian framework into whatever came next. When China fragmented, the scholars who maintained the classical tradition kept a thread of continuity running through the chaos. When a new dynasty rose, it inevitably turned to the same tradition for the legitimacy and the administrative language that the tradition uniquely provided. Wu's decision to make Confucianism the official state philosophy was not just a religious or philosophical choice. It was the single most important act of institutional design in Chinese history, the creation of a governing culture so deeply embedded and so widely shared that it proved capable of surviving everything that subsequent history threw at it. Emperor Wu's outward ambitions matched his intellectual ones in scale, if not in lasting consequence. His military campaigns pushed Chinese territory into Central Asia, Korea, and what is now northern Vietnam, extending the empire to a size that required new thinking about how to connect distant regions to a central authority. The answer, developed partly through Wu's campaigns and partly through the commercial energy they released, was the network of trade routes that later generations would call the Silk Road. The name, invented by a 19th-century German geographer, captures something true about the most famous product that moved along these routes, Chinese silk, so fine and so beautiful that it became a luxury currency across the ancient world but misses the fuller picture. Along with silk moved porcelain and paper and spices and glassware and horses and wool and gold and the quietly revolutionary technologies of ironworking and papermaking. Along with goods moved ideas. Buddhism arriving in China from India along the same routes that Chinese silk was traveling west, beginning a process of cultural transformation that would reshape Chinese civilization as profoundly as anything the Han court deliberately introduced. And along with ideas moved diseases, which is the part of the Silk Road story that ancient sources mention rarely and modern scholarship has come to understand as equally consequential. The Han Dynasty fell in 220 AD, after 4 centuries, to a combination of factors that will be familiar to anyone who has studied the pattern of Chinese dynastic failure court corruption. Regional military commanders who had accumulated enough power to challenge central authority, a series of weak emperors whose inability to govern effectively confirmed, in the mandate of heaven framework, that the dynasty had lost heaven's approval. What followed was nearly 4 centuries of fragmentation, the Three Kingdoms period, and the subsequent division of North and South, during which China was not one country but many. And the memory of the Han became the standard against which every fractured state measured its own inadequacy. That memory was not just nostalgia, it was a political argument. Every ruler who wanted to claim legitimacy described himself as restoring what the Han had built. The Han had not just governed China, they had defined what China was supposed to be. And the weight of that definition, carried forward through 4 centuries of fragmentation, would eventually pull the country back together, because the people who lived through the fragmentation had not forgotten what wholeness looked like. The dynasty that eventually restored that wholeness, that pulled the fractured pieces of the Chinese world back into a single political unit and then built something on top of them that the Han themselves had never quite achieved, did not do it through careful administration or philosophical persuasion. It did it through military genius and political ruthlessness, and what it created was an empire so open, so wealthy, and so confident in its own value that people came from the edges of the known world simply to exist near it. 4 centuries of fragmentation leave marks that do not disappear when a new dynasty rises. The China that emerged from the chaos following the Han's collapse in 220 AD was not the same China that had gone in. Buddhism had arrived along the Silk Road and spread through the divided kingdoms with the particular speed that ideas achieve when the institutions that might resist them are too busy fighting each other to pay attention. The old Confucian certainties had been tested by 4 centuries of evidence that virtue was no guarantee of survival, and the testing had left the tradition more complicated, more internally diverse, and more genuinely thoughtful than it had been at the Han's height. The cultural mixing that came from decades of northern China being ruled by non-Chinese peoples, Xiongnu, Xianbei, and others from the steppe, had introduced elements into Chinese art, music, food, and daily life that the pure Confucian tradition would never have permitted in through the front door, and that 4 centuries of side doors had made permanent. The Tang Dynasty, which rose in 618 AD under the military family of Li Yuan and his son Li Shimin, inherited all of this complexity and did something that dynasties emerging from long periods of chaos rarely manage. Instead of trying to simplify the complexity back to some imagined original purity, it embraced the complexity and built a civilization on top of it that was richer and stranger and more genuinely interesting than anything that had come before. Chang'an in the 7th and 8th centuries was not merely the capital of China, it was the largest city on earth and the most diverse, in ways that are genuinely startling when measured against the usual assumptions about the medieval world as a collection of isolated civilizations that barely knew of each other's existence. The city was laid out on a grid of extraordinary regularity and scale, a planned metropolis of perhaps 1 million people at its peak, divided into carefully organized wards, each with its own markets and residential districts and administrative functions. Within those wards lived Persians who had fled the Arab conquest of their empire and brought their Zoroastrian religious traditions with them. Nestorian Christians from the Middle East, whose version of Christianity had been declared heretical by the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD, and had subsequently spread eastward along the Silk Road to find in Tang China a tolerance it had been denied in the Roman world. Sogdian merchants from Central Asia, who dominated the Silk Road trade and maintained their own communities in the city. Korean scholars who had come to study at the Tang Imperial Academy and sometimes stayed for decades. Japanese students. Japan was in the middle of a conscious program of importing Tang Chinese civilization, wholesale, and the students it sent to Chang'an carried back everything from Chinese script to Chinese urban planning to Chinese court ritual, embedding Tang culture so deeply in the emerging Japanese state that its traces are still visible in Kyoto today. Arab and Indian and Southeast Asian travelers, traders, monks, and diplomats moved through the city's streets, and the Tang court received them with a confidence that is the specific confidence of a civilization that is genuinely certain it has nothing to learn from its visitors and therefore has no reason to fear them. Into this world, a world defined by its openness, its self-assurance, and its assumption that Chinese civilization was the standard against which all other civilizations were to be measured, stepped a woman whose existence the civilization's own framework had made impossible. Wu Zetian entered the imperial court as a concubine of the Emperor Taizong when she was around 14 years old. When Taizong died, she should have disappeared into the permanent retirement that awaited the concubines of deceased emperors, a life of Buddhist devotion in a convent, invisible and politically irrelevant. Instead, through a series of political maneuvers that historians have debated for 14 centuries without reaching complete agreement on the details, she became the concubine of the new emperor Gaozong, then his empress, then the effective ruler of the empire during his final illness, and finally, in 690 AD, the Emperor of China in her own name, the only woman in 4,000 years of Chinese imperial history to hold that title without qualification or regency. She was 65 years old when she declared herself emperor. She had been effectively governing the empire for years before that. The declaration was, in a sense, simply making official what had already been true for long enough that pretending otherwise had become a strain. The means by which Wu Zetian consolidated and maintained her power were not gentle, and her Chinese critics, who were numerous and persistent, focused on them with an intensity that her defenders have argued was never applied with the same thoroughness to male rulers who did comparable things. She had rivals and opponents removed, exiled, demoted, executed with the decisive efficiency of a ruler who understood that hesitation was more dangerous than action. She used her secret police, the feared Jin Yue of the Wu period, to monitor and suppress opposition with a comprehensiveness that created genuine fear among the aristocracy. These things are true and should not be minimized. They are also true of virtually every Chinese emperor who held power for more than a decade, and the historical tradition's decision to treat them as the defining fact of Wu Zetian's reign, while treating them as footnotes in the biographies of her male counterparts, reveals something important about who was writing the wound. History, and what they were most disturbed by. What the same historical tradition consistently underemphasized was the quality of her governance. She expanded the imperial examination system, creating pathways to official power that were more genuinely meritocratic than the system she inherited. She promoted officials on the basis of demonstrated competence rather than family connection, creating a bureaucracy more effective than the aristocrat-dominated system it partially replaced. She made sound decisions about taxation, agricultural policy, and frontier management across decades of rule. The Tang Empire under Wu Zetian was not declining. It was, by most measurable standards, well governed. The discomfort this created for a civilization built on the Confucian premise that women belonged in the domestic sphere and men in the public one was a discomfort that the historical tradition resolved by simply looking away from the evidence the Tang produced alongside its political achievements, the greatest flowering of Chinese poetry in the tradition's long history, and the two poets at the center of that flowering could not have been more different from each other or more perfectly complementary. Li Bai was the poet of the ecstatic moment of wine drunk under moonlight, of friendship, of the mountains that made the human world seem beautifully small, of the present, instant seized and celebrated before it vanished. Du Fu was the poet of the suffering world of soldiers dying on distant frontiers, of families separated by war, of the specific grief of watching a great civilization damage itself through the choices of people who should have known better. Both of them lived through the An Lushan Rebellion of 755 to 763 AD, in which a military commander of non-Chinese origin launched a revolt that nearly destroyed the Tang Dynasty and did destroy the cosmopolitan self-confidence that had made Chang'an the wonder of the medieval world. Li Bai wrote about the rebellion from a distance, with the particular sadness of a man watching something beautiful end. Du Fu wrote about it from inside the refugees, the destroyed cities, the soldiers who would never come home, the Chang'an he had loved reduced to a ruin of its former self. Both of them were writing about the same thing, the cost of what happens when the institutions that hold a civilization together are weakened faster than they can be repaired. The Tang never fully recovered from the An Lushan Rebellion. The regional military commanders who had fought the rebels used the crisis to entrench their own power, and the central authority of the Tang court spent the next century and a half in slow, hemorrhaging decline, still functioning, still producing extraordinary art and scholarship, still maintaining the examination system and the administrative structures that made it identifiably continuous with the dynasty at its height, but gradually losing the control over its own territory, That was the precondition for everything else. When the dynasty finally fell in 907 AD, it fell not to a foreign conqueror or a dramatic internal revolution, but to the accumulated weight of 150 years of slow institutional erosion. The grief that followed was genuine and deep, not just for the political structure but for the version of China that the Tang had represented, a China so certain of its own value that it had opened its doors to the world without fear. That particular confidence would not return for a very long time, and the civilization that replaced the Tang the Song dynasty would be, in many respects, the most sophisticated society on earth. It would also discover, in the most devastating possible way, that sophistication is not the same as survival. The Song built marvels. They printed books, coined paper money, and sailed the seas with compasses of their own invention. They created the nearest thing to a modern economy that the ancient world ever produced. And then they were destroyed by people who could not read. There is a particular kind of tragedy that visits civilizations which become extraordinary at everything except the one thing they need most at the moment history tests them. The Song dynasty of China, which ruled from 960 to 1279 AD, was, by almost every measurable standard, the most sophisticated society on earth during its peak centuries. Its cities were larger than any in Europe or the Middle East. Its commercial economy was complex enough that scholars today debate whether it was approaching something recognizable as proto-industrial development, a debate that would have seemed absurd about any other medieval society. It produced the magnetic compass, movable type printing, sophisticated gunpowder weapons, and paper money in the same centuries that European economies were still operating primarily on barter and the memories of Roman infrastructure. Its imperial examination system had become the most genuinely meritocratic, large-scale system of government selection in the history of the world. To that point, selecting officials through rigorous competitive testing that in principle, and often in practice, allowed talent to rise regardless of birth. Its art was of a refinement that subsequent Chinese dynasties spent centuries studying and trying to replicate. And in 1279, after 50 years of increasingly desperate resistance, it was destroyed, not by a civilization more sophisticated than itself, by horsemen from the steppe who could not read its books and had no interest in its philosophy and cared nothing for the extraordinary machine of culture and commerce they were dismantling. The lesson arrived, with a force that Chinese civilization has never fully absorbed and never fully been able to set aside. The Song's relationship with military power had been complicated from the dynasty's founding. The chaos of the late Tang period and the fragmentation that followed it had been produced, in large part, by regional military commanders who accumulated enough power to challenge the central authority they were supposed to serve. The Song founders, drawing on that lesson, deliberately privileged civil officials over military ones in the dynasty's administrative structure, ensuring that the men who held actual political power were scholar officials, shaped by the examination system, rather than generals shaped by campaigns. The policy produced the extraordinarily sophisticated civil administration that is one of the Song's great achievements. It also produced a military that was chronically underfunded, institutionally subordinated to officials who did not understand it, and structurally incapable of the kind of decisive offensive action that might have dealt with the threats on the northern frontier before those threats became existential. The Song solved the problem of the warlord. In doing so, it created the problem of the defenseless capital, and when Genghis Khan's forces began moving south in the early 13th century, the most advanced civilization on earth discovered that its extraordinary sophistication had been built on a foundation of deliberate military weakness. Genghis Khan died in 1227 without having completed the conquest of China. His son, Urgedei, continued it. His grandson, Kublai Khan, completed it, and the process from beginning to end took roughly 70 years, a measure not of Mongol weakness, but of Song resilience. The northern territories fell first, in a series of campaigns of devastating efficiency that demonstrated the Mongol military's extraordinary capability for combined operations, strategic coordination across enormous distances, and the systematic use of terror as a force multiplier. Cities that resisted were destroyed as object lessons for cities that had not yet decided. Cities that surrendered quickly were spared as object lessons from the other direction. The calculation was deliberate, and the results were consistent. The northern population of China, which had been among the largest and most densely settled in the world, was dramatically reduced in numbers that historians still debate, and that the archaeological and documentary evidence has never allowed to be established with precision, only with the confidence that they were catastrophic. The Song in the south held for decades longer than anyone watching from the outside would have predicted, and the reason was geography combined with the particular stubbornness of people who understood what defeat would mean. The Mongol cavalry, the most effective military force in the world on open terrain, was much less effective against fortified river cities, surrounded by water, and accessible only through channels that negated the advantage of mounted speed. The Song defenders adapted, using the landscape with the intelligence of people who had lived in it for generations and understood its possibilities in ways that the conquerors did not. They held the twin fortress cities of Xiangyang and Fandeng for 5 years, a siege that consumed enormous Mongol resources and required Kublai Khan to import siege engineers from the Middle East who could build the heavy artillery, needed to finally crack defenses that had resisted everything the Xi Mongols had previously brought against them. When those cities fell in 1273, the Song's strategic position became untenable. The end came at the naval battle of Yamen in 1279, in the waters off the southern coast, where the last Song loyalists had retreated with the child emperor and the remnants of the court, with nowhere left to go and no army capable of protecting them. What happened at Yamen has passed into Chinese historical memory in the form of an image so powerful that its literal accuracy is almost beside the point. Lu Shufu, a senior Song official, held the 8-year-old emperor in his arms at the bow of the flagship as the Mongol fleet closed in and jumped into the sea. The accounts written later, by people who were not there, shaped by the need to find meaning in a defeat of this magnitude, say that tens of thousands of people followed him. Soldiers, officials, court ladies, servants, people who had followed the Song court in its long southward retreat and had run out of south to retreat to. The numbers are almost certainly larger than reality. The essential truth they encode is not a question of numbers. A civilization was ending, and the people who had identified most completely with it made a choice that said, in the clearest possible language, that what they were willing to lose was more important than what they might have saved by surrendering. Whether 10,000 people jumped, or 100, or simply a handful of the most devoted, the image became the image of the Song's end, not a military defeat, but a statement about what loyalty to a civilization looks like when the civilization has run out of options. Kublai Khan, who ruled the resulting Yuan dynasty with a genuine interest in Chinese culture and a sophisticated administrator's appreciation for the systems he had conquered, could not resolve the fundamental problem of Mongol rule in China, which was that no amount of administrative competence could make foreign occupation feel like something other than what it was. Marco Polo arrived during Kublai's reign and described a China of fabulous cities and extraordinary commerce that his European readers assumed was fiction, because the gap between what Polo described and what they knew from their own experience of the medieval world was too large to credit. He was not lying. But the Chinese subjects of the Yuan dynasty, living inside the reality that Polo found so marvelous, experienced something that his account did not fully capture: the particular humiliation of the most sophisticated civilization on Earth being governed by people who had not built it and did not, in the deepest sense, belong to it. That experience, combined with the memory of what the Song's military weakness had made possible, settled into the Chinese historical consciousness as a lesson about the relationship between cultural achievement, physical power. Being extraordinary was not enough. Being extraordinary while unable to defend what you had built was a kind of failure that no amount of extraordinary could redeem. China would spend the next 700 years trying to hold both things at once, and would discover that the attempt created problems of its own. The dynasty that finally expelled the Mongols and restored Chinese rule was founded by a man who had grown up in a China under foreign occupation, who had begged for food as a child, watched his family die in a famine, and carried into the exercise of power a fury about vulnerability and weakness that would shape everything he built and everything he destroyed. Zhu Yuanzhang was 14 years old when his family began to die. A famine swept through his region of central China in 1344, and it took his father first, then his mother, then his older brother, leaving him alone in a world that had just demonstrated, with complete thoroughness, that it had no particular interest in his survival. He could not afford coffins. He wrapped his family in cloth and buried them in a field. And then he had nothing. No family, no home, no resources of any kind, and no reason by any external measure to expect that his life would become anything other than a brief and miserable continuation of the poverty that had killed the people he loved. He begged. He wandered. He spent years in a Buddhist monastery, not from spiritual conviction, but because the monastery had food and the road did not. He survived, by a combination of resilience and luck, through years that would have destroyed most people, and when the rebellions against the Mongol Yuan dynasty gave a man of his particular qualities and his particular fury a path toward power, he took it with the focused determination of someone who had spent decades understanding exactly what powerlessness felt like, and had decided, with the totality of his being, never to feel it again. In 1368, he drove the Mongols out of Beijing and declared himself the Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming Dynasty. He was one of only 2 men in Chinese history to rise from peasant origins to the imperial throne. The dynasty he founded lasted 276 years, and it was shaped, in every important detail, by the specific texture of everything he had survived before he reached it. The Hongwu Emperor's governance was not the governance of a man who felt secure. It was the governance of a man who had learned, in the most direct and personal way possible, that security was an illusion that the world destroyed without warning and without mercy, and who responded to that knowledge by trying to control everything within reach with a comprehensiveness that crossed, at regular intervals, into paranoia. He abolished the position of Prime Minister, the highest administrative position below the Emperor, because he could not tolerate the existence of a single official with enough consolidated power to potentially challenge his own. He distributed the Prime Minister's functions among 6 separate ministries that reported directly to him, creating an administrative structure that required the Emperor to personally manage an impossible volume of decisions, and that worked adequately when the Emperor was capable, and catastrophically when he was not. He created the Jinyu Wei, a secret police force of extraordinary reach that monitored officials, intercepted correspondence, and conducted investigations with methods that the historical record describes in terms that make them indistinguishable from what later centuries would call state terror. He executed officials and their entire extended families, 3 generations in some cases, on charges of corruption or disloyalty, that were sometimes clearly genuine and sometimes clearly pretextual, and the cumulative death toll of these purges across his reign ran, by historical estimates, into the tens of thousands. He was building, with the materials of absolute power and absolute distrust, a dynasty that would outlast him by more than 2 centuries. The question of whether the dynasty succeeded because of what he built, or in spite of it, has no clean answer. What the Hongwu Emperor and his successors did build, that was unambiguously extraordinary, was the Wall. The Great Wall, as most of the world pictures it, the crenellated stone and brick barrier running across mountain ridges and through desert landscapes in the photographs that have made it one of the most recognized structures on Earth, is primarily a Ming construction. The earlier walls, going back to the Qin, had been built of rammed earth and had degraded significantly over the intervening 15 centuries. The Ming rebuilt and extended them in stone and brick, with a thoroughness and a sophistication that reflected both the genuine military threat posed by the Mongol successor states on the northern frontier and the particular psychology of a dynasty founded by a man who had experienced what it meant to be defenseless. The wall was a statement, as much as a fortification, a line drawn in stone between the Chinese world and the steppe world, a physical expression of the determination that what had happened under the Yuan, the experience of foreign conquest and foreign rule, would not happen again. It was also, in retrospect, a choice about which direction to face. China was looking north, watching the steppe, building walls against the threat it knew. The threat it did not yet know was coming from the sea. Zheng He's voyages, which ran from 1405 to 1433 under the patronage of the Yongle Emperor, represent one of the great turning points of world history, and their significance lies not in what they achieved, but in what was done to them after they ended. The voyages themselves were extraordinary by any measure. Zheng He commanded fleets of hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of men, sailing routes across the Indian Ocean that Chinese navigators had been developing for centuries, and that Zheng He extended and systematized with the resources of an imperial state behind him. His flagship, the treasure ships, that Chinese records describe as over 400 feet in length, dwarfed anything sailing in European waters at the same moment. His fleets reached the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the coast of East Africa, returning with giraffes and exotic goods, and the acknowledgement of distant rulers that China was the greatest power they had encountered. The voyages were not exploration in the sense that Columbus or Vasco da Gama would later practice it, Zheng. He was not looking for unknown lands. He was extending China's tribute network across the maritime world, projecting the Yongle Emperor's prestige into waters that had never seen a Chinese imperial fleet, making visible the reach of a civilization that wanted to be recognized as the center of everything. In terms of what they demonstrated about Chinese naval capability, the voyages were proof that China in the early 15th century was the most capable maritime power on Earth. And then the Yongle Emperor died, and the officials who had always opposed the voyages as expensive, dangerous, and philosophically incompatible with proper Confucian governance, found themselves in a position to end them. The arguments against the voyages were not frivolous within the framework of Ming governing values. The expeditions cost enormous amounts of money that the northern frontier defense, the wall, the garrisons, the constant management of Mongol successor states also needed urgently. The Confucian scholarly tradition had always regarded commercial and maritime activity as less legitimate, less fundamentally Chinese, than the agricultural civilization of the interior. The eunuch officials who organized and led the voyages, Zheng He himself was a Muslim eunuch, castrated as a child during a military campaign, were regarded by the scholar official class with a mixture of contempt and genuine political anxiety, because eunuchs with imperial patronage accumulated resources and influence that the examination system officials found threatening to their own position. Every individual argument for ending the voyages was coherent. The decision to not only end them, but suppress and in some cases destroy their records, so that later emperors who might have wanted to revive them would not even know the full extent of what had been done, was something different. It was not a decision. It was a slow accumulation of smaller decisions, each made for reasons that seemed adequate at the time, whose cumulative effect was to turn China away from the sea at the exact moment in history when the sea was becoming the medium through which the world would be reorganized. When Portuguese ships appeared in East Asian waters in the early 16th century, they found a China that had the technology, the navigational knowledge, and the sheer scale to have been their competitor in those waters, and had simply, for reasons that made complete sense from the inside, chosen not to be. The consequences of that absence took generations to arrive in their full force, but they arrived. The dynasty that had turned away from the sea would eventually be brought down not by the sea, but by the same forces that had always threatened China from the north combined, this time with an internal exhaustion so profound that the Ming court could not mount the defense that its founders had built the entire dynasty to provide. What replaced it would be China's last imperial dynasty, and it would preside over both the greatest territorial extent in Chinese history and the most devastating humiliation. The Ming dynasty did not end dramatically. It ended the way that exhausted things end slowly, then all at once. By the 1640s, the dynasty that Zhu Yuanzhang had built with such ferocious determination was hollowed out from within its treasury, depleted by decades of military spending on the northern frontier, its agricultural base wrecked by a series of droughts and famines that killed millions and produced exactly the kind of desperate, mobile, hungry population that becomes the raw material of rebellion. The rebel leader Li Zicheng marched on Beijing in 1644 with an army that the weakened imperial forces could not stop, and the last Ming emperor, rather than be captured, walked into the imperial garden behind the Forbidden City and hanged himself from a tree. He left a note asking that the rebels not harm his people, taking responsibility for the dynasty's failures on himself alone. It was a gesture of dignity in the face of complete collapse, and it would have been the ending of the story if what came next had been simply another Chinese dynasty rising from the wreckage of the last one. What came next was the Manchu, and the dynasty they founded would last 268 years, and end not with a rebel army, but with a revolution, and not before presiding over both the greatest territorial expansion in Chinese history and the most systematic humiliation the civilization had ever endured. The Manchu people who swept into Beijing in 1644 were not foreigners in the simple sense that the Mongols had been. They had been building their state on the northeastern frontier of Ming China for decades, studying Chinese governance, adopting Chinese administrative structures, incorporating Han Chinese officials into their own system, and preparing with considerable sophistication for the moment when Chinese weakness would give them the opportunity they were waiting for. When a desperate Ming general opened the gates of the Great Wall to let them through rather than surrender to the rebel forces he considered a worse option, the Manchu marched into Beijing not as raiders, but as administrators already equipped with the institutions and the personnel to govern what they were taking. They declared the Qing dynasty, required Han Chinese men to adopt the Manchu hairstyle of the shaved forehead and braided queue as a visible mark of submission, and then proceeded to govern China with a thoroughness and a cultural commitment that over generations made them, in most respects, indistinguishable from the Confucian Chinese rulers they had replaced. The Kangxi Emperor, who ruled from 1661 to 1722, mastered classical Chinese literature and governance with a dedication that put many Han Chinese emperors to shame. The Qianlong Emperor, who ruled from 1735 to 1796, compiled an enormous imperial library of Chinese literature, wrote tens of thousands of poems in the Chinese tradition, and presided over a Qing empire that at its peak encompassed roughly 13 million square kilometers, the largest China has ever been, stretching from the Pacific coast to Central Asia, from Siberia to Vietnam. It was an extraordinary achievement, and within a century of that peak, the civilization it represented would be on its knees. The British Empire's relationship with China in the early 19th century was built on a commercial frustration that the British government converted, through the application of military force, into one of the most nakedly cynical episodes in the history of modern imperialism, which is a category with considerable competition. Britain wanted Chinese goods. Tea had become so central to British daily life that the country's trade balance with China was deeply negative. Enormous quantities of silver flowing east in exchange for tea and silk and porcelain that the British public consumed without apparent concern for where the silver was coming from, or what the long-term implications of that flow might be. Chinese consumers, meanwhile, showed little interest in British manufactured goods. The Qianlong Emperor had famously told a British trade delegation in 1793 that China had no need of the outside world's products. The solution that the British East India Company arrived at was opium grown in British India, shipped into China through a network of traders and smugglers, sold into a population that had no cultural or medical framework for understanding addiction, and exchanged for the silver that reversed the trade balance. By the 1830s, opium addiction had become a genuine social catastrophe in Chinese coastal cities. Millions of people addicted, families destroyed, government officials corrupted by a trade whose profits were enormous and whose source was a foreign empire that understood perfectly what it was doing to the population it was selling to. When the Qing government's special commissioner, Lin Zexu, seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British opium in 1839, writing, with a dignity that subsequent events make almost unbearable to read, a letter to Queen Victoria, asking her to consider whether she would permit the sale of a substance that caused such devastation among her own people. Britain went to war. The First Opium War lasted 3 years. It ended with the Treaty of Nanking, in which China was required to open 5 ports to British trade, pay reparations of 21 million silver dollars, and cede Hong Kong not to compensate Britain for any harm China had caused, but as compensation for the opium that China had destroyed in the act of trying to protect its own population from it. The treaty was the first of what Chinese history calls the unequal treaties, and it was followed by more, with more powers, on terms that became progressively worse, as each defeat demonstrated that resistance was possible at less cost than the last round of reparations had suggested. The logic was circular, and it was deliberate. Each treaty that opened China further created new opportunities for foreign, commercial, and territorial ambition, which created new friction, which created new pretexts for new military action, which produced new treaties. The system fed itself. The Second Opium War ended in 1860 with British and French forces in Beijing, and what they did there when they arrived became the image that Chinese historical memory has preserved with the particular sharpness that civilization reserves for the moments it cannot forgive. The old summer palace, the Yuan, was a complex of gardens and pavilions built over more than a century by Qing emperors, an architectural achievement of extraordinary beauty and cultural significance, housing one of the greatest collections of art and books and objects in Chinese history. The British and French forces looted it systematically and then burned it, an act that the British commander, Lord Elgin, described as a necessary measure to punish the Qing government for its treatment of British and French prisoners, and that Chinese historical consciousness has treated ever since as something that requires no additional description to make its meaning clear. The ruins were left standing. They are still there today, preserved in Beijing as a memorial, not restored, not rebuilt, left exactly as they were. The broken columns and the empty foundations, because some wounds are more powerful as wounds than they would be if they healed. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 delivered the blow that the Opium Wars had not quite managed to make final. Japan, which had spent 30 years deliberately dismantling its traditional institutions and rebuilding them on Western models after the arrival of American warships in 1853, had demonstrated the same lesson that the Opium Wars had demonstrated for China defeated the Qing military with a speed and a completeness that shocked not just China but the Western powers, who had assumed that Japanese modernization was imitative rather than genuinely transformative. Taiwan was ceded. The fiction that China's military weakness was temporary, a problem of equipment rather than of fundamental institutional failure, was destroyed. The Qing government, watching from inside a political system that could no longer reform itself quickly enough to survive the pace of external pressure, attempted a series of reforms in 1898 that lasted 100 days before being reversed by a conservative court faction. It attempted a different kind of response in 1900, encouraging the Boxer Rebellion against foreign presence in China, which ended with a multinational foreign force marching into Beijing and imposing reparations so large they consumed a significant portion of the entire imperial revenue for decades. The dynasty that had ruled for 268 years, that had presided over the greatest territorial China had ever known, that had produced emperors of genuine cultural brilliance and administrative competence, collapsed in 1912 to a revolution that almost no one at the time was certain would produce anything better. The imperial system that had governed China for 2,000 years was over. What would replace it was not yet clear. What was clear to every Chinese person alive at that moment was that something had broken that could not be put back together in its original form. The only question was what the new form would be, and that question would take the next 37 years and tens of millions of deaths to begin to answer. The answer, when it came, arrived in the form of a man who had grown up in a China already living inside the century of humiliation, who had watched foreign powers treat his country as a territory to be managed rather than a civilization to be respected, and who had decided, with the particular certainty of someone who has identified the problem clearly and arrived at a solution that he is prepared to impose at any cost, that he knew exactly what China needed to become. The Republic of China, declared in 1912 after the Qing dynasty's collapse, was built on the assumption that removing the imperial system would allow something better to grow in its place. That assumption proved, within a decade, to be catastrophically optimistic. The institutions that hold a country together, the administrative networks, the legitimate authority structures, the shared understanding of who has the right to make decisions and enforce them, do not appear automatically when the previous institutions are removed. They have to be built, carefully, over time, by people who agree on enough fundamentals to cooperate on the project. The China of 1912 did not have those people. It had warlords, regional military commanders, who had accumulated enough armed force to control their territories and enough ambition to resist any central authority that threatened their position. Within years of the Republic's declaration, the country that had been governed as a unified empire for most of 2,000 years was effectively divided among competing power centers, none of whom was strong enough to unify China, and none of whom was willing to accept a unified China governed by anyone else. The Republic's central government in Nanjing, under Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, controlled some territory and claimed to represent all of it. The Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921 and growing through the 1930s into a genuine military and political force, controlled other territory and made the same claim. And into this fragmented, contested, exhausted country, in 1937, Japan marched. The Japanese invasion and occupation of China from 1937 to 1945 produced a human catastrophe whose scale resists adequate description and whose full dimensions are still contested by historians working from incomplete records on all sides. The most conservative estimates of Chinese civilian deaths from the invasion run to 8 million. The higher estimates approach 20 million. The Nanjing Massacre of December 1937, in which Japanese forces killed somewhere between 40,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, in 6 weeks, the range of the estimate itself, a testament to the difficulty of counting the dead, when the people doing the counting have reasons to miscount in both directions became the concentrated image of a violence that was occurring across a much larger territory and a much longer time. Chinese civilians were killed in their cities, their villages, and their fields, by bombing and by ground assault, and by the particular cruelties that occupying armies commit when their command structures permit it and their ideology encourages it. The nationalist government retreated westward. The communist forces fought a guerrilla war from the countryside. The Japanese occupied the coast and the major cities. And China bled for 8 years, while the rest of the world's attention was distributed across a war of genuinely global dimensions in which China's suffering was acknowledged in principle and addressed in practice barely at all. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, which had been nominally suspended by the need to fight a common enemy, resumed almost immediately. 4 years later, in October 1949, Mao Zedong stood at the gate of Tiananmen in Beijing, the gate of heavenly peace, the southern entrance to the Forbidden City, where emperors had entered and exited the center of Chinese power for 5 centuries, and announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese people, he said, had stood up. The phrase was deliberately chosen and immediately understood. After a century of unequal treaties, foreign concessions, military humiliations, internal chaos, and the particular degradation of watching the civilization that had been the most sophisticated on earth, treated by foreign powers as a territory to be managed rather than a country to be respected, the announcement carried a weight that went far beyond the political moment. The century of humiliation was over. China was, once again, governed by Chinese. What that governance would mean in practice was not yet clear on the day Mao spoke. It would take years and catastrophes of a scale that no one standing in Tiananmen Square on that October day would have been willing to predict, to find out. The Great Leap Forward, announced in 1958 after nearly a decade of communist governance, had established the basic structures of the new state, was Mao's attempt to compress decades of industrial and agricultural development into a few years through the application of revolutionary will and collective mobilization. The theory was that the same energy that had won the Civil War, the mass engagement of ordinary people in a common project, directed by the party toward a shared goal, could be applied to economic transformation. Collective farms would replace individual agriculture. Backyard steel furnaces, operated by peasants who had been trained in days rather than years, would supplement industrial production. Targets were set that bore no relationship to actual productive capacity, and officials at every level of the party hierarchy understood, with the clarity of people who had watched what happened to officials who delivered bad news, that their survival depended on reporting success regardless of what was actually happening in their districts. Grain production figures reported to Beijing bore no relationship to grain production. The grain that was actually produced was extracted from the countryside in quantities based on the fictional figures, leaving farming communities without enough to eat. When people began dying, the deaths were not reported. When local officials tried to report the truth, they were accused of sabotaging the revolution. The famine that resulted from this interaction of catastrophic policy with a political system that had systematically destroyed the capacity for accurate information to reach the people making decisions lasted roughly 3 years, killed by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 15 and 45 million people. It was the largest famine in recorded human history, produced not by drought or crop failure in any primary sense, but by decisions made by human beings in offices, enforced by a political structure that punished honesty and rewarded the lies that kept the disaster invisible until it was too late to stop. The Cultural Revolution that Mao launched in 1966, 6 years after the Great Leap Forward had quietly ended without official acknowledgement of what it had been, it was a different kind of catastrophe, not primarily a famine, but a systematic attack on the very elements of Chinese civilization that had sustained its continuity across 4,000 years. Mao, who had lost political standing after the Great Leap Forward's undeniable failure, and who understood that the party apparatus he had built had developed interests of its own that were no longer reliably aligned with his personal authority, mobilized young people, the Red Guards, teenagers and young adults who had grown up entirely within the People's Republic and had been formed by its education system as the instrument of a purge that targeted not just his political opponents, but the entire tradition of learning, cultural inheritance, and institutional knowledge that had defined Chinese identity since the Zhou Dynasty. The Confucian tradition, the examination system, the classical texts, the reverence for scholarship, and for the accumulated wisdom of the past, was declared a tool of feudal oppression and attacked with a systematic thoroughness that the first emperor's book burning, 16 centuries earlier, had not approached. Temples were destroyed, books were burned. Teachers were publicly humiliated by their students in struggle sessions that combined the logic of confession with the theater of punishment. Scholars, artists, scientists, and officials who were accused of insufficient revolutionary commitment were sent to labor camps, beaten, imprisoned, or killed. The examination system, which had been one of the most distinctive and enduring features of Chinese governance since the Han Dynasty, was abolished. Universities closed. An entire generation's education was interrupted or destroyed, the generation that would have been, in a normally functioning society, China's next doctors and engineers and administrators and scholars. When Mao died in September 1976 and the movement he had launched was ended, China was exhausted in a way that goes beyond the ordinary political exhaustion of people who have lived through difficult governance. The country had survived, within a single generation, a civil war, a foreign invasion, another civil war, the largest famine in human history, and a decade of organized social violence directed at the foundations of its own civilization. The people who had lived through all of it had done so inside a political system that did not permit them to name what had happened, to grieve what had been lost, or to hold accountable the people and the decisions that had produced it. They were survivors of catastrophes that officially had not occurred at the scale at which they had occurred, carrying losses that could not be publicly spoken, in a country that was asking them, having survived all of this, to now build something better. The question of what better looked like, and whether it was possible to build it from the materials that remained, was the question that China would spend the next several decades beginning to answer one practical, patient, collective decision at a time. The man who would begin that rebuilding was not a revolutionary in Mao's mold. He was a pragmatist, a man who had survived the Cultural Revolution himself, who had been purged and rehabilitated and purged again, and who had arrived at the conviction, through the specific education of repeated personal catastrophe, that the only question worth asking about any policy was the simplest possible one: does it work? Deng Xiaoping was 74 years old when he began remaking China, and he had earned every year of that age in the specific way that the 20th century offered to people who survived it in China through repeated cycles of rise and destruction and survival and return that would have broken most people, and had instead produced in him a particular quality of clarity that is only available to someone who has lost everything more than once and kept going anyway. He had been purged during the Cultural Revolution, sent to work in a tractor factory while his son was thrown from a window by Red Guards and left permanently paralyzed. He had been rehabilitated and purged again and rehabilitated again. He had watched the country he had helped build nearly destroy itself twice in 20 years, first in the famine that the government was still not fully acknowledging, and then in the decade of organized social violence that had targeted the civilization's own foundations. By the time Mao died in 1976, and the political maneuvering that followed eventually brought Deng back to effective power in 1978, he had arrived at a conviction that was simple in its formulation and radical in its implications. Ideology that produced famine and chaos was not ideology worth defending, and the only honest measure of any policy was whether it actually worked for the people it was supposed to serve. The reforms Deng launched, beginning in 1978, did not announce themselves as a revolution, because announcing a revolution in a country governed by a party that had come to power through revolution and had spent 30 years defining itself through revolutionary ideology would have required a confrontation with the past, that the past political system could not survive. Instead, the reforms announced themselves as adjustments, practical measures, modest experiments, the sensible correction of temporary imbalances. The agricultural communes that had been the organizational basis of the Great Leap Forward, and that had continued to operate inefficiently in the decades since, were quietly dissolved. Farmers were given back something approaching control over their own land and their own production, and were permitted to sell surplus on open markets rather than delivering everything to the state. The immediate result was an increase in agricultural productivity so substantial that it should have been impossible to attribute to anything other than the obvious, that people who work for themselves work harder and smarter than people who work for a collective whose rewards are disconnected from individual effort. Deng did not claim this as a philosophical vindication of markets over socialism. He simply noted that it was working and moved on to the next experiment. The special economic zones established along China's southern and eastern coast were the next experiment, and they were more radical in their implications than the agricultural reforms, though they were presented with the same careful framing of modest practicality. In designated zones, Shenzhen, initially, a small city near Hong Kong that was chosen partly because its proximity to an existing capitalist economy made the comparison between the two systems impossible to ignore. Foreign investment was permitted, market pricing was allowed, and the rules that governed the rest of the Chinese economy did not apply. The theory was that the zones would serve as laboratories contained experiments whose results could be observed, evaluated, and if successful, extended. What actually happened in Shenzhen across the following decade was less an experiment than an explosion. The city that had been a fishing village of perhaps 30,000 people in 1979 became a manufacturing metropolis of millions within a generation, drawing workers from every province in China, producing goods for every market in the world, and generating economic growth at rates that the standard models of development economics had not imagined possible. Deng visited Shenzhen in 1984 and saw what the laboratory had produced, and he made the decision that the experiment was over not because it had failed, but because its success was too clear to limit to a zone. The reforms went national. What followed across the next 4 decades is the most rapid, large-scale economic transformation in the recorded history of human civilization. And that statement is not hyperbole, but the considered judgment of the economists and historians who have studied it most carefully. China's GDP grew at an average annual rate that sustained itself for decades in a way that no other large economy had ever managed. The infrastructure of a country that had been substantially agricultural as recently as the 1970s was rebuilt from the ground up: highways, high-speed railways, airports, ports, and cities of extraordinary scale, constructed at a pace that made the industrial revolutions of the 19th century look measured by comparison. The manufacturing capacity that the special economic zones demonstrated was possible expanded to encompass an entire economy, making China the production base for a global consumer economy whose appetite for cheap manufactured goods was, it turned out, essentially infinite. The wealth generated by this process was distributed unevenly, as it always is, with coastal cities and the people best positioned to participate in the new economy accumulating enormously, while interior provinces and people without education or connections or access to the zones caught up more slowly. But even accounting for the inequality, the reduction in poverty that the transformation achieved was of a scale that no previous development program anywhere in the world had approached. Somewhere between 700 million and 1 billion people moved from conditions of genuine material deprivation into something recognizable as a modest but stable material existence. The number is so large it requires a moment of stillness before it can be at all appreciated. And yet, sitting with 4,000 years of Chinese history at one's back, the achievement raises a question that the achievement itself does not answer. The dynasties that built the most sophisticated civilizations of their ages, the Han, the Tang, the Song, each contained within their structure the mechanism of their own eventual failure. They accumulated power in ways that made information flow upward selectively, rewarding officials who delivered comfortable news and punishing those who delivered uncomfortable truth. They created systems of governance so dependent on the personal qualities of individual rulers that the system failed whenever a capable ruler was followed by an incapable one. They built their legitimacy on performance, on the delivery of stability and prosperity in ways that made any significant failure potentially destabilizing, because the mandate of heaven logic that justified their authority also justified the authority of whoever could credibly claim to do better. The Chinese Communist Party governs today with an awareness of this history that its own publications make explicit. The study of dynastic failure is a serious subject in Chinese political science, and the lessons drawn from it inform policy in ways that Chinese officials discuss openly. The awareness is genuine. The question that the awareness cannot answer is whether knowing the pattern is sufficient to escape it, or whether the structural features of concentrated, unaccountable power reproduce the same vulnerabilities regardless of whether the people exercising that power can name them. What has survived 4,000 years of Chinese history is not any particular political structure, because every political structure China has produced has eventually fallen. It is not any fixed cultural content, because Chinese culture has been transformed by every catastrophe and every foreign contact and every internal revolution it has encountered across 4 millennia. What has survived is something harder to name precisely: a relationship to continuity, a way of understanding the present as accountable to an extraordinarily long past, a collective memory that operates at a civilizational scale and shapes behavior in ways that are visible even to people who have not consciously studied the history that produced them. The extraordinary emphasis on education in contemporary Chinese families is the examination system's ghost. The anxiety that Chinese governments display about their own legitimacy, the constant effort to demonstrate performance, to show that the current arrangement is delivering what it promised, is the mandate of heaven operating under a different name. The sensitivity about sovereignty and territorial integrity that shapes Chinese foreign policy in ways that outside observers sometimes find disproportionate is the century of humiliation, speaking through the present into the future, saying what it always says. Never again, never again, never again. The Yellow River still floods. Less catastrophically than it once did, because 4,000 years of hydraulic engineering have gotten very good at managing it. But the river has not been tamed. It has been negotiated with, which is, perhaps, the most honest description of what Chinese civilization has been doing with its own nature and its own history across 4,000 years. Not conquering the problems that the landscape and the human condition and the logic of power present, negotiating with them, returning to them, finding ways to live alongside them that are slightly better than the ways that came before. The civilization that built the Grand Canal and the Great Wall and the Silk Road and the examination system and the Three Gorges Dam and the high-speed rail network connecting 300 million people across a continent-sized country is the same civilization that built flood control, ditches beside the Yellow River 4,000 years ago. The scale has changed beyond any ancient imagination. The essential activity practical, patient, collective, refusing to be defeated by the size of the problem has not. What do you think? Is 4,000 years of continuous civilization a story of exceptional wisdom, or a warning about what it costs to hold something together for that long? The patterns are all still running. The tension between leading through virtue and controlling through law, the gap between sophistication and the ability to defend it, the question of what happens when a government cannot acknowledge its own failures. Could the cycle turn again, the same cycle that brought down every dynasty that believed it had finally found the permanent solution inside a system that is more aware of that cycle than any that preceded it? Leave your thoughts below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who thinks the history of the world began in Europe. Because for most of the last 4,000 years, the longest chapter was being written somewhere else entirely.